So carta gur míle maigus obair fad a bheith linniu. Seo le sé is a péile na gluigeí garma agus tá cúpla lá go fáil agin so amarach be in nacht be scríbnaí a tléfa an seo ócad sin an blu chuinse gahla in a whip chuinse dúsa go bheith gúirne but be scríbnaí a tléfa an a nacht be ferm an pobl an amarach trasna ag gardaí an pobl méid ball the building the fermúirí actually agus grúpi defriúla a take over ar san dóin níos far doing ar fada. Just sahar Jean chur sa Gaelic agin suas sa grach nua agus bhéile tealaí agin seo le ceála an teannos, daoisar an teannos agus cearlan boraniachta and sin be Anita sin be Jerry leis an eile le seo chuan le cultúrtha actually. So to following the fellowship of Brád sin a lig Echtlan. So you're very welcome to day 6 of Féile na Gluigeí Garma. We'll have plenty left to do so tonight we have our screenery and Clever or the Riders from the Mountain event, which is always a real highlight of the festival where young writers, local writers come and read poetry, sing songs, share stories. So you are all very welcome to that. Tomorrow we have the People's Farm, our farm and bubble over at the garden. And we will have local farmers there that you can make connections with. We also have a food box scheme that we run there, where we'll have local organic food every 2 weeks, and you can go and meet the farmers and hear about where our food's coming from. So we're trying to break this stranglehold that all of the supermarkets have on us, and we want to bring nice, nutritious food into our communities. Tomorrow afternoon we have a great event with Tommy O'Connell, and that will be a Chianáin Crafts or healing workshop. And it's about connecting with the ancestors, and Tommy's done a lot of work around that, so it'll be great to see a lot of people there. On Saturday we have an intensive course, Irish course up in Newhill, and there's still spaces available there. We have a family day here with Chianáin singing, Chianáin dancing and oral workshops, as well as some arts and crafts for the kids. And then on Saturday night is the end of the festival, and we'll have a local concert for local musicians here in daonna, and you can bring your own alcohol or stay in if you like. But to borrow the culture,
I'm going to still come do it. Sure, check your phones, please. Make them not silent.
Girl, might get watching. I like the next door. But with your piece done, to make sure I reach the chorus, so I'm so excited about this conversation. We're here with Talha AlAli and Bríd Ní Chíanáin. Talha's book has been a revelation to me when I was reading it. I recognised so much of our community and my family in the book, so we're really excited to hear more about that. So Talha is a Palestinian psychotherapist, author, human rights activist, and the founder of Decolonised Minds, a platform dedicated to culturally grounded and politically conscious approaches to mental health. He's based in Ireland, and he currently maintains a private practice while also serving as a psychotherapist with the Red Cross, supporting Arabic speaking survivors of torture and war trauma. Bríd Ní Chíanáin is a political psychotherapist and activist, and has been in practice as a Gestalt psychotherapist, clinical supervisor and teacher since 1994, working with adults, young people and children, as well as couples and groups. Bríd is the co-founder of the Gestalt Centre in Belfast and a member of the European Association of Gestalt Psychotherapy, and the British Association of Counselling and Psychotherapy. So we're going to have the conversation first, and then we'll open the floor out for any questions that people will have. So we're going to begin with Talha. So Talha, we want to hear a wee bit more about the book and about the platform, but we want to hear about what inspired you to write this amazing book and what inspired you to create this platform.
First, thank you so much, Bríd Ní Chíanáin. I tried to learn Irish, and I'm sad to be using English here. But hopefully one day I will be fluent in Irish, so I can do this as well. What inspired me to write the book is that my work first in Palestine, where I started my career. I started working with survivors of political torture coming from Israeli prisons, and I started working with children and mothers who would have their father either being killed by the Israeli forces or being detained. And usually I was trained in Western sector, which is in Palestine, because that's kind of the dominant narrative in the world. And I find it really irrelevant, the people I work with, especially when I use professional terms, like one of the examples, and I even mention it in my book. I worked with a grandmother who has nightmares about the houses they were kicked out of in 1948. And when I wrote down nightmares, she was like, "You're not writing nightmares. I want these to remind you that they live somewhere else." And I was like, my land is not really suitable for them. And then I've moved to work in Jordan with people coming from Yemen, Jordan, Iraq, Syria, who are injured. I worked in a hospital as a therapist for people who were injured or trauma, and mainly with children, because there was pediatric counselor there. And the way they relate to the world, the way they heal, like for example, you would have them sitting, the Syrians, and just reminding themselves of where they came from, what are the names of the places, how they used to smell. And I was like, I relate to this, I wasn't trained on how to navigate this. And what kind of broke me completely, my work in Libya. I worked in detention centers where, I think a lot of you is aware, the Africans who try to cross the sea and come to Europe are detained by either Coast Guard or militias in Libya. They're put in detention centers and they turn them into slave markets. And when I was there, they were bragging that they're trained by Italy and the Netherlands, so they keep the migrants there to not come to Europe. And the way they would heal through communal singing, through rituals, through things that connect them to the land. I also found my training really irrelevant to them, especially when I go in with a notebook, and that's something I even started learning in Palestine, but then I found the same with these detention centers. Notebooks for them is what the person who would torture them would use. They'd have a notebook there, and they would write things down. I thought it was a therapeutic too, and then it became something that would trigger them. And then people who would refuse to speak to me, I used to usually say they are resistant, they are not compliant, and then I discovered that they are setting boundaries, and they're kind of determining that I'm not communicating with you because they see me as an extension of authority. And then I started questioning my position and my power, because I go, as an expert, you've broken people. And I started taking notes as far as 2015 or 2014 to tell myself how I should work. How can I audit my privilege before I enter the place? I know I can move out from this place. I know I'm not living in a refugee camp. I know I'm not detained. I'm not being sold in a slave market like what I've seen in front of my eyes in Libya. The guards would be selling a man or a boy or a woman to go and work for someone in their house for just 100 quid. So I would start recognizing how I applied the experiences. And then coming to Ireland and working with Arabs here, who would say that their therapists are not really relating to their pain. Or, for example, they would say you have to move on if you lose something, or you have to accept it. And a lot of people don't want to accept that their children were killed. So that's another thing that kind of got me to start reading more decolonial work, like Frantz Fanon, like Edward Said, and to understand the othering, but at the same time to understand how Western frameworks usually decide what should be universal and leave it to the world. If it doesn't fit you, then there's something wrong with you. So the way of healing stripped people from their identity, that's been exported, by Western frameworks. So I started to read through the pluralistic approach to psychotherapy, because I felt like I've been using it without knowing it. It's out there. And I found that we need in psychotherapy to have approaches that tell us there's no one approach that's correct, there's no one answer to two things. And the idea of having a dominant approach that should be universal and stripping people as well from their communal sense and locating trauma and mental health disorders within an individual, it was kind of one of the greatest epistemic injustices that are happening. To tell someone you are broken rather than you've been severed by community, from your community, from your land, from your way of being, and we don't see the collective trauma, and we don't see trauma as something continuous or intergenerational or passed down. And one of the greatest violations that Western psychotherapy does, that I also highlight a lot in the book, we're trained to not speak about politics or religion. And when it comes to politics, a lot of our mental health suffering is because of political decisions. It's because of systems of harms, because of race, it's because of a housing crisis, it's because of unemployment. And then when someone comes to us and we don't acknowledge all these, then we're just seeing them as broken. You have to work in the way of your life, rather than our life is beating you up from all directions. So these were other things to inspire me to speak about it. And in fairness, Ireland is very inspiring in this, because you're the only white place in West Europe that have been colonized, have been suffering a lot. And even these things are not acknowledged. And one of the things that sparked my interest, if you come to Palestine, for example, my village, my town, every place, every name of a place tells the story of how this place has been formed, or if it served a purpose. And when I came to Ireland, a lot of the places, their names are in English, like Dublin. What does Dublin mean? What does Belfast mean? I don't know. But I'm sure, without even knowing, I can bet that if you tell me the Irish name of Belfast, tell you what's the purpose or how this city was formed, and it's the same with all villages. So stripping the language that we use for our land and then for our beings are things that Western psychotherapy and colonialism have stripped away from us, to look at us as we will have to fit with what we think should be universal. I think I spoke too much. I think it's better.
And you kind of touched on the next question for you, Talha. You speak a lot in the book about cultural resistance. And I wanted to just hear a wee bit more about the importance of that cultural resistance in the healing process.
Yeah. Well, I've always viewed resistance as a way of sticking to your identity and to who you are, who you really are. And the cultural resistance is one of the therapeutic things that I speak about first, because I would have to always emphasize that I'm against locating dysfunction within a person and trauma within a person, because we're part of culture, we're part of community. And the other thing is how you can remind yourself that you are part of something bigger and stronger than what you're going through now, or than what happened to you. So the cultural resistance, either you're keeping your cuisine, you're keeping your language, like the Irish language now, you're keeping your connection to the habits that your grandparents, your great-grandparents and ancestors have done. They make you feel that you're part of something. Because also, the way I view it, you might think it's more of conspiracy. But if you think about it, Western approaches to psychotherapy where they strip you from your culture, from your community, it's kind of using the divide and conquer on a cycle. So every person for themselves mentally. And trauma, you cannot heal from trauma without connection. So you have to connect to evil, to kind of heal your trauma, or have your nervous system loosen up a bit. You start connecting to your senses. And the cultural aspect of resistance would always tell you what you are, and to look at yourself with respect, rather than the term that an old philosopher, Blackburn, say you start developing double consciousness to adapt to a culture that look down at you. So you would be looking up to them, not being part of them, and at the same time looking down at where you came from. So you have to embrace where you came from. And that's another thing, actually, when you're severed from your language, that Ionad Gestalt, he's a Kenyan decolonized author, sadly passed away last year. He described it as the cultural bomb, where you don't have the language to speak about your pain, to speak about your joy, to speak about your stories. So you end up with nothing. And your connection to culture, cultural existence, will make you stay to an identity that you really appreciate and that you really like. So you relate to yourself rather than running away from yourself. And that's why sometimes we see people that try to change their accent. And a lot of people come into my accent and happy with my accent because it tells that they're not from here. When you look at my skin color, I'm not from here anyway. Even though I became an Irish citizen in February, and I'm happy with that. But still, I cannot claim that I have gone through all the things that Irish people gone through. Irish people would embrace me, would teach me about themselves, will integrate me within the community, but wouldn't force me to assimilate. And this assimilation will leave you with a community that will not accept you, that you're within 100%. At the same time, you will not accept where you came from 100%, and you get stuck. So cultural resistance. And cultural resistance for us is Israel. We are from that land, and we belong to that land. Rather than them changing the names of the street, changing the names of villages, and taking more and more lands. And one of the things that are really related to Palestine cultural resistance, when the Israeli occupation started, they started changing the trees. They're bringing trees from Austria, from Germany, from Switzerland, Atlantic, and Palestine. All these trees are dropped in because they want good for the environment, and all the trees are coming from under them. And that's for the last 30 years. Once we stick to our culture, we know how to relate to the land. And one last point about culture as well. We've never seen land as commodity, like the colonizers would do. We've always seen themselves as people who belong to the land. So the land owns us. So this kind of flipped way of seeing the land as commodity, as something that you need to use to your best interest. And that's a conversation we even just had before we came here, because you said your land and potatoes and stuff outside. And I was saying, in Palestine, when we plant potatoes, we have to plant fava leaf after that, and then crush it before we harvest it. So it nourishes the soil again, because the potato is very aggressive for the soil. And this is how we see the land, as we something have to take care of because we belong to it. And that's where we will be buried. Yeah, so that's another thing to do with the cultural resistance.
And we're going to speak with Bríd wee bit now about what inspired you to become a psychotherapist, and also I wanted to have your views around that cultural resistance as well.
I'm here at Castle Junction anyway. A recent discovery that I've made about myself is that I'm an accidental psychotherapist. It was never planned. My idea of psychotherapy was that it was middle class, self-indulgence, and like a hobby and all that sort of stuff. That changed. And I'll tell you in a second how that changed. But basically, I come from a politically aware household. We had in my family the range between people who were alive during the Avion, to people who fought in the 20s, to people who became nationalists. There are socialists in the family, there are communists in the family. So I come from a long line of people who have political opinions about everything. So my awareness was grounded in that, and certainly I remember learning my history more from my mother than from my father, I have to say. And going to Irish classes at night in the primary school when I was 10, and not realising the significance of it other than when I sang the harp at once in Tara's halls, I couldn't sing the line that says, "This song was made for the pure and free, it'll be never sung in slavery." And I could never sing that line, even at 11. I don't think for one second I knew why I couldn't sing it. It was just something stuck in me. And my awareness developed. Actually, the first demonstration I was ever on was in 1965 against bombs. It was to commemorate Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And we were sitting outside the American consulate in Queen Street singing, "One man's hand can't help a strong man," etc., etc. And the cops would come across and say, "Sing that one you were singing before, we like that better than this one." So I was thinking, this isn't working. And then, of course, the next big thing that happened in my life with regards to my political thinking was Vatican II. The election of Pope John XXIII and the development of the option for the chur that emerged in liberation theology. And I was fascinated by it, loved it. It coincided with the beginning of the civil rights movement. I was part of the civil rights movement. In my St. Dominic's uniform, I was proud as punch, let me tell you. School scarf and all, you know. And when I went to university, I started looking more closely at liberation theology, particularly in relation to what was happening in Latin America. And from that, I ended up in my early Marxist reading groups. And from that, I have gone on ever since. My kind of connection begins with psychotherapy when I joined the women's movement, when I had to start challenging so many things that I thought were common sense. And the link with common sense for me was Antonio Gramsci. So I started to read Gramsci and looking at the fundamental question that has remained for me in my life. How do people collude with their oppressors? How do oppressed people collude with their oppressors? And I was particularly concerned about that because I was looking at I was involved in what was happening here, and I was watching the rise of these different organisations that were placating the Brits, basically. And I couldn't understand why Irish people would do that. I just couldn't get my head around it. So, eventually, moving forward quickly, having got out of jail, big change in my life.
And he ruined everything.
And then it went downhill. My brother, who was a volunteer, died in 94. My son was born in 93. The ceasefire was in 94. I started my Gestalt training in 91, looking at how we could support people to be effective organisers in their areas, thinking about how people relate to each other, and at the same time asked if we would set up a volunteer group like a first responders group who would go around the national districts when there had been a house raid or someone had been killed or someone had been arrested or something was going on. We would go and we would talk to the families, visit the families. Not knowing at that time, in fact we knew nothing at that time. Talk about missionaries, we knew nothing at that time. But what became very clear was that connection was the fundamental route to recovery from traumatic events. Connection, people amongst people, talking to people, being with people, supporting people is the first stage. So, when I started this training, the training ended in 94. Just my training ended the day the first ceasefire happened. And my first training ended when the first ceasefire happened. And I remember somebody coming on the radio or the TV And they were being asked, when will our societies return to normality? Well, we all knew what normality was in our districts. And somebody said 5 generations. And I said, that's my son, his children, his children's children, his children's children's children, his children's 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 children. And when I counted it up, it's about 130 years. So somewhere or other, we were being expected to carry the burden of what had happened for 130 years more. And at that stage, I said, that's enough. And at right about the same time, a report came out from one of the large hospitals in relation to the number of children who have been referred for psychotherapy help, psychological help. And there were 53 referrals in 1989, and everyone was a child of the security forces. Not a single child had been referred from our districts. I did a small mental health survey with Clarnua back in 1998, I think it was, looking at what people needed in the districts and how did they get any kind of therapeutic support. And mostly it was the community psychiatric nurses who were going out in the districts talking to people, and they were grossly overwhelmed. And at the same time, people were saying to me, why should I go to psychotherapy? Where's that information going? So they saw psychotherapeutic work as being an arm of the state. Mm-hmm. So, which I completely understood at the time. So, one day somebody asked me if I would see a friend of theirs. And I said yes. And that began the road to psychotherapy. And what I discovered very quickly, like Talha here, I discovered very quickly that Western psychotherapy doesn't fit us. We're an extended family-based community. I had 72 first cousins, for God's sake. There were 67 children in my block when I was growing up. We are an extended family-based community. And I heard a woman once on the radio, a Nigerian woman, and she was speaking from the Centre for Torture and Recovery, the Recovery Centre in Camden Town. And this was about 1991 or 92. And she was saying, how can this help me or heal me when my village is being killed? And I said, I understand exactly what she's talking about. Exactly what she's talking about. So I started working after the ceasefire as a Gestalt psychotherapist, which I can tell you all about if you want. It's a very interesting form of psychotherapy. I chose Gestalt over anything else because you cannot separate the individual from context. You cannot. You can't. When you're working with a person, you're working with their context. You can't separate them. Mental health concerns don't come from inside. They come from the connection that you have in your context. So that was of more interest to me as a Marxist than, sitting in a room and talking to a single person and trying to figure out what's wrong with me. That didn't make any sense to me. So, and I heard somebody one day saying, no child reaches 13 years and says, I can't live grow up to be an addict. Like, no child does that. Something happens. So, when people were coming in and telling me they were on medication for maybe 30 years, or they couldn't sleep at night, or they had fibromyalgia, or irritable bowel syndrome, or whatever, I was saying, I don't know what to do here. I don't know what to do. And it was then, when I was working in a project with Bernardo's around how parents support their children in the aftermath of the ceasefire, that I discovered another form of working, which was very well dovetailed with Gestalt, which I'll talk to you about later on. But it's the most hopeful form of psychotherapy that I have come across, and basically what it means is at the exact moment when the most terrible thing happens, because you survive, because you don't die at that moment, because you survive, your nervous system is orientated to recovery and health. So in the type of work that I do, I don't chase what was the problem, how did it happen, who was there, what happened, what. I want to know, how did you survive? How have you survived ever since? And I can work with that through the nervous system, not necessarily needing very much in the narrative, which suited me because I do psychotherapy with a lot of former combatants who don't talk about what happened, can't talk about what happened for legal reasons and so on. And they don't have to, that's the point. We can work like this and no one has to be shamed by the story or frightened by the story or made worried or anxious by the story. We can do it in a totally different way, which is an amazing discovery for anybody who lives in a society where from moment to moment the danger is ever present, the threat is ever present. And the second thing that I learned about that challenges the definition of post-traumatic stress disorder, no such a thing in my book, but at that moment people say to heal from trauma you need safety, as if safety is something that comes at the end of the struggle. Safety is a moment-by-moment process that people have access to from our innate systems if we're in contact with other people who also have that in their innate systems because they're human. And it doesn't matter if you're in an isolated cell, it doesn't matter if you're struggling along a road from one place to another in the dark. If you know that you're living your life in the context of other people, that's where recovery is. Isolation is the core of trauma. Isolation is the core of trauma that tells you you will never be like anybody again. You are marked from that. You have the mark of Cain on you. And you'll always have this problem because that happened to you. That's not true. That really is not true. And the last 40 years have told us that that's not true. Research has shown us that that's not true. And yet the diagnosis of trauma that was developed as a result of the defeat of the Americans in Vietnam is the thing that goes around the world and tells us who was traumatized, who wasn't, how hard were you traumatized, well you're less traumatized, how much compensation should you get, how close are you to the state, you can't have compensation because you're connected to so-and-so, and all of this. That's what the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress does as part of American foreign policy. So I don't agree with it. Clients come in and say to me, I have post-traumatic stress disorder. I say, where did you get that diagnosis? Where did you get it? Because you didn't get it here. You got it from somewhere else. So Samar Jabbar, who's a psychoanalytic psychotherapist in Palestine, says there is no post in post-traumatic stress. There is no post. And the important thing is that whatever support for mental health that you have must be connected to your society. And a big discovery I made quite early on in my career, coming out of liberation theology. I met a Gestalt therapist, a lovely man, Philip Nichtenberg, who came over here to work with us during the war when nobody else would. Philip came. And he adhered to liberation psychology. And liberation psychology for Philip and for liberation psychologists, of which I'm one, says there can be no complete social transformation without what we learn from how people become people in the field of mental health and mental health support. Without that information, there is no true social transformation. We will get some variation of what was before because we haven't paid attention to how we became who we are. So my psychotherapeutic approach is based in liberation psychology. I am a gestaltist. I also work with somatic experiencing, trauma recovery processes. And I cannot imagine working any other way. So, can I have a bit more time? Yeah. I warn people when I start. Like, seriously. I'd be here at midnight, you'd be falling off your perches, but I'd still be talking. My father said I could talk for Ireland, and he's right. When it comes to this, I can talk for Ireland. So, cultural resistance. Cultural resistance. Way a long time ago, I very happily discovered Douglas DeHage's essay on the importance of de-Anglicizing the Irish mind. And it was like somebody opened a window. And to be cut off from your culture is, of course, what the colonizer wants to do. As Thaithí says, he wants to cut you off from everything, all the markers in your existence that tells you who you are, because you're not them. And they want what you have, so they have to make you not who you are. So one of the things that Pat listens to, we're shouting at TV about this all the time. His favourite one is when RTE says the Grand National and he's shouting about English Grand National. And someone comes on and says Irish dancing, I go traditional dancing. Or Irish, our Irish. Why do we talk about our culture as if we are a foreign people looking in on the existence of this culture? You don't hear French people talk about French music. French students, we have the French weather forecast today. There's a woman on RTE stood in front of the TV last week. I was so angry about it. It was on RTE. She had an Irish name. England was kind of half off the map, which is very rare, very rare. Ireland was centre stage, no border, nothing. And she kept talking about the rain coming in over Ireland. And I'm saying, well, where else is she talking about? There's a big map of Ireland behind her, and she's talking, oh God, I was demented. So, all these indicators telling us all the time how we are one step removed, like when you say when the culture looks up and looks down, we are forced to be one step removed from the British culture because, we're not British, we're kind of paddies of some description. A very either very unkempt British back garden, or we are a threat to the western coast of England and therefore have no right to exist as a separate entity. So we have this constant telling us we're not them. Even loyalists don't think that they're part of them. So we're not them, but we're also not that, because we actually, over 800 years, we're not sure about who that's supposed to be anymore. So we're caught in this void, this place where we're told that we are to be not sure about who we are unless we're defined and told by the colonizer who we are. And so my fascination always is, when I think about Gramsci's question again, how do oppressed people collude with their oppressors? And my answer to Gramsci, if he was here today, I'd say it to him, only not in Italian, because I don't speak Italian. I'd say to him, well, Antonio, some people don't, some people fight. So my interest is, why do some people fight and some people don't? That's my interest. As somebody who's interested and committed to revolution, I want to know, how do we encourage people? How do we encourage people to see themselves as the determinants of their own future in their own sovereign country? That's my interest. And how come they don't? That's a kind of psychotherapeutic interest as well. What happens? How do we become de-identified? How do we become not who we are? Well, John Davies, who was the architect of the plantation, wrote to the British Crown and said, in the next generation we have a hope that they will be English in every way, and there will be no difference betwixt us but the sea. And that was the plan, to wipe out the Irish identity, and it went out with British foreign policy and British imperialism to every country they went to in the world. We were the original plan. This was the template. and has gone everywhere since. So, it's not a surprise when people talk to us about, what team you might support or whatever. Like, I remember my mother talking to me about Palestine, and I was saying, well, have they not put this place in there, this Israel thing? And my mummy said to me, the Brits wanted it, we don't. It was as simple as that. Brits wanted it, we don't. And incidentally, like everybody else in the 1960s, I read Exodus. I bumped off school for the first time in my life to go and watch the film Exodus. If you haven't read it, believe me, watch the film. The book is rubbish. Watch the film. It'll tell you what popular culture was saying. But at exactly the same time, here in Belfast, someone gave me a book called The Night and Its Going by Ethel Mann. And she was a communist woman living in England who wrote about the Nakba. The Night and Its Going. If you can still get it, I have a copy at home. If you still get it, read it. It totally overthrew Exodus for me. It was never the same again. I discovered that Palestine was like us. Palestine was like us. But I have to say very clearly, and it's one of the things I learned when I went to Palestine, we are at a different stage of colonial dominance from Palestine. The Brits have been at this for 800 years. And my experience of going to Palestine was the history of Palestine, which was changed by the recognition by the United Nations of the existence of Israel. Because I'm not a Middle East historian, or as I would say, West Asian historian, but I do know that much. And I know that if we want to watch and see a model of how culturally, the dominant form of colonisation of the land done culturally, people should study Ireland. They should. Khalidi says the same thing. If you want to understand Palestine, study Ireland. Because the stage that we're in is we have some kind of neo-colonial system in the south. We have the outworkings of settler colonialism in the north, and it's perpetuated by the border. So cast your mind around any other country where the Brits have been, but it's been partitioned, and tell me there's happy people living in a jolly way together, because it's not true. So if you want to see colonialism in action, and they didn't have to keep battering us into the ground, they didn't have to keep using the capping wash, they didn't have to keep forcing us into exile. They didn't have to keep doing that. They just had to structure a system that on the surface looks like a modern, European, EU-based, soon to be part of NATO. All they have to do is to continue to find a class in the country that will do their bidding for them and keep the structures in place that reinforce the representation of colonialism in a way that is acceptable to the people in the country. And anybody who knocks doors during election time knows that. You don't even have to know, you just have to look at the Clár on RTE any night of the week. And you'll know the orientation. So I remember a film by Bob Quinn years ago, everybody laughed at his film called The Atlantean, years ago. And one of the important things he says was what British imperialism did that was most devastating for us. While we were connected to all of the countries in the world, through our sea routes and through all the connections that we had everywhere, when Britain colonised us, they turned our eyes from the world to Britain so that we can't see the other side. We can't see where we were and who we were. We cannot see the trace of ourselves because we're always looking through this framework that is British colonialism. So I'm endlessly interested in the cultural struggle that people engage in day and daily. And I remember as a child, my Irish teachers being arrested out of school in the evening, and being whisked off somewhere. And I remember not being able to, when we were kids, and the cops used to walk down our street, if it was raining, we used to stamp in the puddle water and shout, "Kevin Byron," and run away. You know, so how deep does it go in the memory that we have? I'm on the downward slope of late youth. That's why I have these memories. When you're my age, you'll have them too. So you just have to watch it. I remember in St. Donald's being taught elocution classes so we could speak like people in Westminster, because we were going to be the ruling class in the north. So the system that grew up in the wake of coming to the realisation that you don't actually have to keep battering the colonised into the ground. All you have to do is set up structures. And you wear them down, you wither them on the vine, and we all know from legacy struggles here that the British policy in Ireland is delay, deny, die. That's their policy. Wither the desire for national unity, wither it on the vine, make it as hard as possible without actually any more having to keep people in cells. So the last thing I'll say is, I went to Palestine and I passed by Gilboa prison where the prisoners came out. The prisoners used spoons to get out of jail. And it's right on the side of the road. I mean, it's like right where the bus, nearly where the bus stops. And I've been thinking a long time about prison struggle and how people stay alive in prisons and how people fight on the front line of struggle in prisons. And as I was saying last week, we were joking in our family, if I say I'm freezing, your man here says freezing, you don't know freezing. The winter of 78 was freezing when we were in Longcash. And I thought, that's true. How did they survive? How did the people in Gilboa survive? How does it go on? And the kind of psychotherapy I discovered showed me how that happens. So shouldn't have heard me back.
And we touched on Palestine there, and we wanted to speak just a wee bit more about Palestine and come to you, Talha, as a Palestinian living in Dublin. What has it been like for you to be based in Dublin and watching what has happened to your homeland? You're from the West Bank, so explain a wee bit about what's actually going on in the group here. Yeah, I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, it's something very hard to say. I'd rather be there, not here. Yeah, because all my family's there. I'm only with my wife and daughter in Dublin. And Tulcairn and Chianáin, I'm from Tulcairn, but Tulcairn and Chianáin in particular, we're in the north of the West Bank, and we're kind of classified as the capital of terrorism in the West Bank, because a lot of the fighters, they either come from Tulcairn and Chianáin, or they go from Tulcairn and Chianáin and train others to become fighters. So where I'm from, it's hard to describe it, because like I'm watching it now. The last time I've been there 2022, I'm watching places where I took my wife and daughter when we visited in 2022 that don't exist anymore. Over 900 houses have been destroyed. All main streets have been dug. All of my friends or my friends' children were killed. So it's just a strange thing to go and to realise that these people are gone, not there anymore. And there are other things that even Israel uses. Like, for example, my aunt's a neighbour. She was accused of killing Israeli soldiers, so they came in the house he was in. They destroyed it on top of him. They pulled him out, took his head, and left the body for the mother to bury him. And these stories, they don't make sense when you tell them to people in Dublin. They think you're exaggerating or whatever. But that's exactly what they do. Like, we have over 600 bodies from the West Bank in prisons, serving sentences because they're accused of killing Israeli soldiers, or they died before they finished their sentence. So they have to serve sentences in their body. And one of the very personal things is that we need to do some procedures for my father, because we suspect that he had cancer. And Israel is holding over 4 billion of the Palestinian government money. So doctors don't get money, teachers don't get money, nurses don't get salaries for the last few months. So they have to go outside the hospital and do other jobs other than being a doctor in order to pay your bills and feed your children. So they're only on 10% capacity. And my father, until now, is unable to go and book an appointment for his procedures or scans. And that's a place where the media doesn't talk about. So these are other things that they think I could maybe get my father here. And then when I looked into it, it takes around 12 months for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to decide whether to give him a visa or not. And if I would mention his sake, they would say he'd come here to become a burden on the system. Even though I've been paying tax in this country since day one. I arrived working and paying tax, but this doesn't really, it's not considered. And again, like looking from afar, and I have a few clients that I see perform, either based in Gaza or in the West Bank. And when I listen to these stories, I feel like I've survived all this, and it's still like I'm not in peace, being physically away, because I'm mentally there. And when you mentioned about trauma and you survive, it's a continuous trauma. You didn't finish, didn't end. Yeah, there's no end point for it. So it's very bad, and I'm not here to criticize also Palestinians, but we have a lot of Palestinians in other places who will be working against Palestinians because, as we say, they buy half of the poor to fight the other half that they cannot buy, and then they pit the poor against the poor, and that's what's happening there. Because a lot of people, like my father's situation, if someone wants money to treat their parents or to treat their children, they will do anything to get that money and to go treat them. And that's on top of having settlers all the time taking more lands, burning houses, burning cars, killing people, and on top of the occupation itself, and on top of the world looking at us as savages. And the foods bring it back to the establishment of Israel. Before it was established, we were Britain colonized us, and they sent us auxiliaries and plantains, and they prepared. They killed every movement that could fight the Zionist project, because Balfour Promise was there already. And looking at it, it doesn't matter how people will view this, but they sent Israel to be in Palestine because they hate the Jews in Europe, and they want to put them around savages because this is how they have been described. If they really love the Jews and care about them, they would have given them London or Berlin to put them somewhere safe, but they don't. And then they accuse us of being the terrorists. So all these things kind of when you view it, and when you come here in Ireland, you'll also see how people enjoy. And there's something, I wouldn't say fascinating, but I can't understand how people can shut off. They will come to protest, they cry about killed children, and go enjoy a TV show. I can't. Might be very pessimistic, but I can't understand these people's ability. I don't know if you do it, I'd love if you could teach me that. How can you come out from an extreme, a disturbing experience and misery to just sit down with popcorn and watch a film and enjoy and have a laugh? I understand some people say we're continuing life, but I just find it dissonant. Or maybe because my family is there and they killed in any second, I cannot really relax, even though I cannot change fate. But it's horrible to sit there and see what's going on.
And I wanted to come to both of you on this point. So we're post October 7th, when this latest phase of genocide really took power there. I wanted to know what your opinions were on maybe planned is treated. Like, what has the effect of the genocide been on people here? Yeah.
For most people that I would work with, and they're quite cross-section, it's hard not to be in despair, and it's hard not to be helpless. And it's hard for people to continue to find that there has to be a purpose in this life. Now, if I was to work with that simply as something that has arisen inside that person as an individual, then in my view that would be unethical practice. That's not what it's about. What it's about is someone being able to connect with their capacity to be alive and to live as well as they can in this current context. So I understand because I know, I'm trauma trained. I've spent 30 years doing this work. And when I went to Palestine, I was quite arrogant to think that, I've been through the war here, I know how to handle checkpoints. So I saw checkpoint 300. I know how to handle this, I know how to handle that. And for the first few days in Palestine, I couldn't speak, I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. I couldn't figure out what was going on. I lived inside endless images of life at home. And I realised that I was wading through the condensed history of Ireland in the first 3 days that I was in Palestine. And I saw Ireland before I saw Palestine. And I know that because I'm trained, I know that that's a transgenerational impact. I know that's what it was. What brought me out of it, actually, was a woman from Chianáin. And we were talking together, and I thought I was being politically correct when I referred to the state of Israel. And she said, the land of 48. And I said, God, yes, you're right. And then we started to compare the political geography of both our countries and so on. And it snapped me out of it. And at that point, I realised that our experience is so deeply embedded in our systems that at any time this can happen. We can have this experience of not being able to see the here and now because we're in the there and then. So in the experience, or in the work that I do with clients, is in the moment of survival, what happens is there are two pathways, if you like, of information in the brain. If you're not under a death threat, and I don't use the word trauma very often because it's been so popularized and devalued, it's almost meaningless. So I don't talk about trauma until a client describes something and said, I've been traumatized through it. If they introduce the word, I use the word, but I don't use the word until they introduce it. So at the moment that we can survive, we are connecting with one of the pathways in the brain that orientates us to our health and well-being. The other, if you like to talk in halves, I don't like talking about brains in halves because they don't exist, but the other aspect of that is the trauma vortex, where people are living in a constant state of hyper-alert, broken sleep, medical and psychological disturbances. They're looking at, they're in the there and then and not the here and now. Their concentration can be affected, all sorts of things. Every aspect of their biology is affected for sure. So people live with like trauma in front of their faces. So I want to know, what can I do to support that person to at least see the world without that experience for a short time, and in doing so annex the other part of the brain that allows them to orientate to health and well-being, gets them in touch with their capacity and their coherence, their ability to act on the world and influence their environment. That's my psychological interest. It's also my political interest. How do people keep going? How do people fight on? How do people live from day to day? How do people not give up? How does this happen? So this particular way of understanding trauma, whether the person comes to see me who is a Palestinian or who may be somebody who's severely depressed, or it may be a former combatant or whatever, we all share the same nervous system. When a death threat occurs, our nervous systems respond in the same way. The chemical and hormonal organisation of our bodies gives us the capacity to fight back or get away. And sometimes we can't do that. and we're left with what happens when we can't do that. So our nervous systems are all the same. What makes the difference between the oppressed and the oppressor is that even though the oppressed can have a diagnosis of a traumatic response, their access to recovery is far greater than the oppressed who has little or no access to recovery. We know this here through the hierarchy of victimhood. We know that here. We know why certain people get treated better than others. So when a person who I could fly over Gaza and bomb a school as a young Israeli chap or whatever, and for some reason or other become horrified by the experience of war, for whatever reason. And we do see them with people who come out and say, I was in the IOF and I left because of. So some people do have that experience. But they have access to psychiatry, to money, to rest and recreation, to stable homes, to people who think they're heroes, etc., etc. The oppressed do not have that. They don't have access to recovery. So when anybody tells me that the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress or whatever it is, it's the same for everybody, it isn't the same for everybody. The nervous system responds the same way. The conditions of the play-out is not the same. That's the difference. And I know that Médecins Sans Frontières and Médecins du Monde split. They split over, first of all, the war in the Balkans, and secondly, the genocide in Africa. Rwanda. Because one side was saying black people don't suffer trauma the same way as we do. Like, can you imagine? In this day and age. Anyway, so I am interested in how is your nervous system responding and how does that translate in the context of your life. So I'll give you a very, very quick explanation of that. What we learn is support people to find what we call their matrix of support, all the things in the work that makes you feel good. And if you're doing that in certain places, people will say, oh, I like to walk in the country, and I like good food, and I like to be able to go to a restaurant, and whatever. I was working with a group of women lately, and I asked them, what's in your matrix of recovery? And this woman said to me, my brother was an obair, and I've never been as proud of anything in my life as my brother having been an obair. And I thought, imagine sitting in Westminster and saying, the primary image in my matrix of support is my brother who was an obair. Because our matrix of support is organised through our cultural connection. And it's vital for us to understand and to be in contact with that, so we can contact the part of us that encourages our well-being, our support, our capacity, our coherence, and we do that in the company of others. Thank you.
I think you asked about post-October 7.
Yes.
Just, I should highlight that on October 7th, 2023 was the very first time in Belfast ever. I was driving here to have a concert in the back. Yeah, and I just arrived, and then I met most of them there. And I checked the news, and they were like 7th October, and things have changed. But if I quit before the 7th October, I'll go back to Bríd 7th October in 2023. According to Save the Children report that was published in July 2023, in the first half of 2023, over 400 children in Gaza were denied permission to leave for medical reasons, with an average of 2 children every day. And a lot of these children died without being able to get medical treatment. So that's only 6 months of the history of Gaza and Palestine as a wider a history. The response of people in the south of Ireland, Dublin, and the most places I go to would be Dublin, Cork, and Clare. A lot of people couldn't really see how evil Israel is until the 7th of October. So themselves, they would say, well, we're shocked they're doing this. And we're shocked that the world is still watching doing this, but we're like, they've been doing this for ages. But now it's in a bigger scale, and now it's on the media. And still nothing's happening to them. Like the number one of this, of child fatality in the last 3 years is Israel. The number one in the world. It's the same for journalists' fatality, it's the same for medical staff fatality. No one's doing anything. So two things that I realized ages ago for the Palestine, but people are realizing now that the world is a horrible place and there is no accountability, and there has been no accountability. The second thing what Israel is doing is just repeating history to what happened in Turkey, Ireland, which is the United States now, which happened in Canada, in New Zealand, Australia. They're just repeating the same thing, going to a land, discovering there are people, killing them all, and building another place. So that's just been going on, but people still don't want to realize it, because the people who are doing this are Europeans. The people who have done this throughout history are Europeans. And the idea of going to a place and extracting resources is what is European. Because before that, people had wars between nations, had wars between each other. Also, they would have trade, they would have colonized others and kept the wealth within the place, the resources within the place. And that's what also bothers me when people describe trades that the UK used to do in the past with India, or before the partition, or when they occupied it. They weren't doing trades, they were just stealing. And that's what's happening now. What's happening now in the Congo. So it's all kind of connected to white supremacy, white people's violence. A lot of people are now acknowledging this, but a lot of people acknowledging this are not willing to give up the privilege and the comfort they have to stop this. Like sometimes I'd be arguing with someone, and you might laugh at me, you might support me on this, but if one of the people around my surrounding would go to Starbucks, McDonald's, KFC, I would tell them, if they don't listen, they're not my friends anymore.
Yes, that's right.
Anyone I'm following or friend with on social media, if they would have a post that they're in one of these places,
Yes,
I can't connection with them.
I agree.
Because it's enough telling people this is too much. And even when I speak to them, I don't tell them you stop this because it supports Israel. It's just how can you ethically consume something produced by them or produced by people who are funding them. I don't want to hit them in the pocket. I just ethically can't see myself enjoying Starbucks because I know how much money they save.
Yeah.
So this is the thing where people sometimes see it as a practical thing, as my boycott will affect them. It doesn't matter. How can you eat it? How can you consume that? And it's the same kind of. We used to have health insurance because my wife wants us to have health insurance, private one. My wife is Irish, so you know how you're always afraid about things and you're always worried about health insurance or you're being penalized if you go to your partner. But the one we were with is Leia. I was bought by AXA. We contacted them. AXA supports Israel. We're going out. And they sent us to do some kind of, if you want to continue with other programs, we were like, no, we're just against the idea of being with AXA. My wife was scared at the start, and then she was like, no, it makes sense. We should tell them why we are pulling out. But a lot of people are afraid to be penalized. Even like I have a small article on my blog about the effect of colonialism in Ireland as a case study. And a lot of Irish people, they are afraid of taking compliment because in the past, if you look wealthy or if you look good, the Brits will come to you and tell you maybe you're eating too much, you have to cut down how much you eat. So you're scared of showing any sign that you're comfortable, and then you become scared of compliments. And that's the effect of why Irish people can't accept compliments.
We just had a conversation about that just before.
Seriously.
Can I just say something about I just want to say something about AXA, which is a difficulty for us here in the north. AXA is the last insurance company that doesn't treat political the being in long cash for political actions. They don't treat that as crime. It's the only insurance company that doesn't treat that as crime anymore since Brexit. Since Brexit, every insurance company will tell you that if you were in lung cash, you committed a crime and therefore it affects how much you pay. So AXA's, I think, that knows its market.
Yeah.
It knows its market. And just one other thing on that. And anybody who's been looking at Western writings on colonialism or listening to a lot of stuff I hear on Netflix or a lot of stuff on the internet from universities and they're having these high-powered discussions about decolonisation. They never mention Ireland. It is not in the picture because we're white. Because we're white. We are white like them in skin colour. We don't figure, if we become part of the colonised, then they have to think about Britain differently. They have to think about other things, and that's a step too far. So they'd rather think of us as a strange kind of half-Magby country, even though we have all the status of being a modern society, so-called. A half-Magby country off the west coast of England. And because we speak English, in their view, we may as well be English, and England was never colonised. So we don't even figure, and one thing I learned as a Marxist, you see, if you don't recognise the difference and accurately look at the history, you can't devise an appropriate strategy. So my challenge to all the anti-colonisers who are thinking about it and theorising about it, they better look at Ireland.
Yeah. When you read the book, you have a little section.
Yeah.
Exams from Ireland.
You're off the You're off.
Because I'm not a Westerner. Yeah, and that's also that's another thing just to come on about something I've shifted for me living in Ireland since 2018 and shifted after October 7. A lot of Irish people were telling me, why don't you love bees? Why didn't you want to love bees and do peace with Israelis? I've only once tried to do something in 2011 or 2012. I used to teach theatre for children in Thaithí, and we had a group of actors and actresses coming from Sardinia, from Italy. And they were like, why didn't you work with Israelis and so on, and peace and normalization? And I was like, I'm 100% against normalizing people who stole my land and killed my relatives and my brother and all this. But I told them I'd give it a shot. You find a place that you would like to work with that associated with Palestinian, with Israeli children, and I'm happy to do it. But we do one show in Tulkarem and one show in Tel Aviv. They said, okay, 0 children from Tulkarem got a permission to go to that, to perform in Tel Aviv. And I called them, now leave the project. And I finished my project with them, and they went and sorted themselves out. But this idea of why didn't you love peace? I go back to Malcolm X when he said, like, you don't get freedom peacefully. Whoever oppressed you started this oppression, like, it's not peaceful. And then we go to the Sankan family when he said peace talks between Israelis and Palestinians, between people who are fully armed and normal civilians. It's like a conversation between the sword and the link. You can't have it. And this is what people realize later on, like, yeah, you were right. And people who go to Palestine realize that we are right. Because on the checkpoints we will be called animals. And even Netanyahu, he said, we're Amalek. And no one held him accountable for that. Which means, like, telling everyone, and only recently a lot of Israeli soldiers would be sharing their social media, they're saying to their colleagues, why are you ashamed of saying you kill children? We do it, we have to. They are Amalek. And this is how how arrogant they are, because they have been going away with everything until now. So these are other things that I realized Irish people are now really understanding, rather than listening to us. They're listening to the Israelis talking about us. But still, the sad fact about it, all these soldiers from the IOF can't come here for holidays. Yeah. Well, my family cannot come and visit. So that's another thing that's really painful sitting in Dublin. But I don't think it can change that.
I don't think we're going to get through all the questions. We could sit and listen to you all day, but I'll finish with this question. So Philin and Glickety Garma and Glorna Mona's work is all done around decolonisation. It's about challenging this intergenerational trauma and learning how we as a community, along with the wider community, can come together to start this healing process. I was just wondering if you would have any kind of recommendations of what we could be doing more of as a community organisation to facilitate that healing.
Can I start?
You go ahead.
Yeah, so the word community itself is targeted to my ears, at least. Yeah, so coming together, first is to acknowledge that your ancestors and yourself all went through hardship and still go through hardship, and through systems that have been designed to separate you from each other, separate you from your identity, and separate you from your land and from your sea. And once you realize these things, you would realize how can I reverse that. And not reverse it in the way positive psychology will be telling us. And one of the easiest examples to use, I saw Martin, the dog, and the dog was happy, so waving the tails. Some people assume if the dog is sad, I just wave the tails of the dog and they become happy. It's not this reverse engineering. But it's the way to see the things that these systems are designed to break, we can connect with them. That's one thing. The other thing is that one of the things that an individual psychotherapy in the room doesn't deal with is other sensations. How can I deal with a sense of touching the soil, walking the place and smelling the wood I'm walking in, or the sea? How do I feel when I jump in cold water? All these things don't happen. How do I feel when I plant something and I watch it patiently growing? And these bring people together so we can have something to mind. And this thing to mind can be either our project, our land, or even each other. So coming together as a community, having goals and understanding that the systems are designed to separate us from each other, to make us look down at each other and at ourselves, we will start reversing this to come. And healing comes with connection. Again, I have second what Bríd said. We can't really heal without connection. And something really, really important I will end up with. Western psychotherapy didn't grow up really from a vacuum of curiosity about humanity and human beings. It grew up from an industrial capitalist societies where they wanted to fix you to go back to the factory and work. That's the reason why psychotherapy here was a bent to make people functioning. And who decide what is functional and what's not? Who decide what is normal and what's not? So when you go there, usually in the scales that they do for anxiety or depression or PTSD, there's a functionality elements to it. How functional are you in your daily life? Do you go to work and produce? If not, then you're not used to the system. We have to fix you enough to get back and go produce. So when we view community, it doesn't work like this. You don't need to be really functional and bringing something to the table. Just coming will be therapeutic for you and we will take care of you. And that's something that a lot of people in a capitalist society don't really understand, that you don't need to always give. You can't take without giving something. You don't need to earn it. Because sometimes you say, I earned this. Yeah, great, you earned it. But there's another person who's unable to earn it, or still need it. So give this person. And another thing that people use, there are sometimes people who are really negative and you cut them off your life. But sometimes there are people who are struggling and they really need you. If you cut them off your life, they fall through the cracks. Communities would have people to switch the burden from one person to another all the time. Well, I don't have the bandwidth now to deal with my friend, or maybe someone else, maybe you that does. So within the community, you have alternatives for people to go to, rather than thinking it's all or nothing. So that's another thing I believe communities can provide.
I don't know that I would presume to say what you could do or whatever. I mean, I think what's amazing about what you do here is everything is done through the framework of Irish. And I work with so many people who don't know where they belong for all sorts of reasons of colonialism. They don't know where they belong. I've also been teaching up and down the country for the last 20 years, and I use Irish all the time. I'm by no way fluent, and I rage at the fact that I have to learn my language as a second language. It makes me so angry. But I've really noticed over the years how more and more people will speak Irish to me, and whatever wee bit of Irish they have, they use it. And they all say, God, isn't it great that people are speaking Irish? And I say, yes, just like you. So the fact that it's being done through the framework of Irish is astounding. One thing that I have been involved in recently, which is a departure, I think, and a very good one, because I've been working with RFJ since 1995. A recent project that has started has been taking local community groups and talking to them in the framework of trauma recovery, talking to them in the framework of how we got to be where we are, and even with all the things that's happened to us. And that has been an amazing experience, just to talk to ordinary people. And we're giving them a framework for understanding, what's the psychological understanding of this, and they are making connections that are just, they're amazing for me as a psychotherapist. It's an amazing education. So we're working with community organisations in the men's shed and whatever. But that's what it's about. It's about who am I now in this context with the history that I've had, and how did I get to be here? They're not therapy groups, but they are therapy informed. But they're not therapy groups.
Agus Carges, so we just want to open it up maybe just to 2 questions because we have went over time. If anybody has a question.
I have 2 questions.
Have one.
Just I suppose what we've seen in England with Palestine action and their tactics in bringing that when Francois talks about decolonisation as a violent act, that violence is external from the coloniser, then it's internalised, and then can be expressed outwardly by the colonised against the state, and that's essentially what was playing out in England. Young people being violent, breaking into places, wrecking it, and creating a dynamic for debate around the companies that are funding and running the genocide. So when you look at the Irish context and our revolutionary colonial history, are you surprised in not seeing the same level of direct action in Ireland against companies that are as complicit, and in some cases more complicit than the companies in Britain? And what would your advice be to white people in Ireland, Western people who are perceived as Western, leveraging that perceived privilege to speak up shoulder to shoulder with Palestinians as a white ally? In a sense, and I know that there's loads of people in Ireland who aren't white and don't identify as white, and I know that white itself is a colonial construct, it's not even real. But can we, as the far end of Europe here, colonised people on the far reaches, who have retained that global platform, because we're not black or brown, we are around the world. There's huge networks of Irish people working all around the world and haven't forgot who they are. Is there anything that we can do, Talha, or anything that Irish people can do tactically now? Because a lot of this seems to be like, let's all talk about and heal our trauma as if we're in that post phase. But from when I read the news today, even last night, bombing and obliterating Gaza still, your own hometown has been demolished and is being pincered at the moment by the IOF. So it's great to have the tools to work between the trauma, the suppose now you'd say there's been a complete dip in the movement, there's a bit of fatigue in the movement. I'm having messages sent to me by friends who are on Futella asking me to try and raise awareness in Ireland about Futella, and I'm going, gee, fucking I do that. So there's a problem in the movement right now. And I'm thinking, do Irish people, given our colonial history, have a particularly unique platform to maybe escalate some of our actions for Palestine? Is that something that's a complicated question? Can Irish people use our own history and likewise our privilege as being perceived as white to shout and scream from the rooftops and to target companies that are complicit in Belfast, for example?
I'm afraid if I answer this question, I'll be looked at as a terrorist. But I would quote two people from the Black movement in the United States. The first person, I think her name was Pasta, I can't remember her last name, Pasta. She died last year, or at the start of this year. What's her last name? I'm ashamed to not remember it. She said no nation in history have got their freedoms by appealing to the consciousness of the colonizer. And this is in terms of peace and peaceful movements. So what the guys did in Palestine Action, again, I'm afraid if I say something I won't get back home because I'm considered in the UK here. Yeah, you get the idea about violence and non-violence. And the other person is this Kwame Ture, who said a boycott is the most passive act you can do against injustice. It's not something to be proud of, it's something that's passive. Just say, I don't want to engage. That's another thing. How can you get involved? Either the most passive action where you say, I just don't want to have anything to do with you, no trades, no products, no services, and no Ireland blaming Israel, the match that have been fixed. And the other thing, yeah, like if I was talking about getting blocking places, and in Cork City they also did similar things to the offices of I think it was AlAli or something works, a place works for AlAli to provide technology for Israeli weapons. But I'm very limited because I'm afraid I'll not make it home. But you understand?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
You're right, you have more.
800 years of suffering to get to this privilege. So, yeah, I tend not to see it in such black and white ways, in oppositional ways. I think a lot of people in Ireland are doing what they can do in the conditions that are in Ireland, and some people can do more direct things, some people can do less direct things. And like as Bobby Sands says, you know, everything, no matter how big or how small, is what we do, no matter how big or how small. I think one of the particular characteristics of Ireland, and it comes back to the fact that it's colonial, which is the kind of the other side, Conor, what you're talking about. Judith Herman talks about when people are traumatised, there is a dialectic. There is a dialectic that happens. The desperate need to speak out and say what has happened to you, and the equally desperate need to keep quiet and say nothing. And both responses are qualified by, if I speak out, will I be rejected by the group? Will I be left to die? Will I be whatever? If I keep quiet, I will get sick. But also, that comes out in generations afterwards, but it's incomprehensible to the new generations because they didn't suffer directly. And I did a conference in Clare a few years ago, 2016, to celebrate the centenary of 1916, and it was called Silence and Voice, What Has Happened to Women Since 1916. So they asked me to come from the north and talk about it. And I went on, and I wasn't sure what they wanted me to talk about, but I said, according to Judith Herman's understanding of trauma, the north has been screaming and the south has been silent. And that is not to blame the south, and that is not to blame the north. That is the action of trauma. So you can see that mental health problems in the south are different from the ones here in the north. You can see that. If you work up and down the country, you can see that. And it's like at a national level, the dialectic of trauma is being worked out. And it's in that context that Irish people, whilst having enormous sympathy with what's happening in Gaza, have a very real lived experience of trying to recover from what happened to them, and that places a limitation on what people can do. I think if you're talking about France or Germany or somewhere else, they should be ripping the walls down. They should be ripping the walls down, and they're not. So I think Irish people are, of course we can always do more, but we're doing more in a context that doesn't start as a clean slate. Why are English people not up in arms about the sovereignty of Ireland? Why are they not screaming their heads off for us to have our freedom? And they never did. I lived there for 10 years, believe me, they never did. But at the same time, pockets of English people did. And pockets of Irish people did. And I think certainly in my experience of going up and down the country, there is more and more and more what you refer to in a passive way. More and more people, if I give them a leaflet and say, don't buy those, they don't, we didn't know that. And I say, well, you know now. So it's a process, and it's gaining momentum, the same as our demand for Irish freedom is gaining momentum. I think there's a class issue that's going on with the right. I think that's a different issue, and I think it's a colonial issue that's going on with the right. And we can't ignore it, but it's coming from a different place. I agree. Thank you.
Anyone else want to take up a question? No? Well, yes, Heather.
It's just thoughts off the top of the head, right? And forgive me, my words came out a bit muddled. I definitely don't have as much to share as what you have, and I could listen to you all day as well. Thanks very much. But just on that last point, picking up on the mental health part of it, what I've seen now that I've done both, in the past 8 to 10 years, mental health has had a huge awareness happening across the island. And the fact that I can stand in a local shop and I hear people using the language of anxiety and depression openly without any, embarrassment or shame is amazing. But on the point of on October the 8th, I don't have a television. It's moved like moral decision. 10 years ago my TV exploded, and I just had to get another one, which was the best decision of my life. I would recommend it to anybody. But I went to
6-1.
I go to my mum's house and I seen the news on October 8th, 2023, and after the reporter had said about 2 sentences, I was like, this is genocide. I'm going to try and clear these people off the face of the earth. And that's because of what we've went through. I knew that immediately. So since then, I don't see a lot of news or whatever. I hear bits on the radio or whatever. Whenever I do see those images from Palestine, I just don't understand that either. I don't understand how people see huge landscapes of grey rubble with no life and then go and eat their dinner or go and do whatever they do. And I just say, these images are being shown around the world. How are people not experiencing a traumatic experience when we're seeing this? So I don't know, but I worked in media and stuff before, but I need to think tapping in to that current thing in Ireland of people being aware of that, to tap into that strain of connecting to Palestine, of that kind of how these images and what it does, not just to people seeing it, but unbelievably what the people living there, or trying to live there, is what it's doing, And that's just what came to me, but, how people respond to things and react to things. But as well as that, Ireland is one big community. You have small communities, but we're communal people. And just for anybody in the room with the game of it's a very small thing, but to realise that the English language, you probably know this, but it's good to think of it. It comes from the 11th century. It is a combination of 3 languages. It's a local tongue. It is there for controlling commerce. That's why it came about. It has huge vocabulary because of that. Portrayed as being very intellectual for that reason, but it's not. It's just there to mess with your head. And the small phrase of thank you means to have a reward or to recompense. And no such thing exists in the Gaelic world. Okay? It does not mean anything to us in the Gaelic world. In Gaelic we say, go roll my nugget, which means, may you have good. And that is because we were communal people. We did not own anything. Under colonisation, it's about owning as much material things as possible because they believed that's what made them powerful and great. In the Gaelic world, we didn't own anything. It didn't mean anything. When you think of yourself as a group of people, people didn't think individually. So it didn't have that hold over people. And the most important thing to us was to be good. And that makes complete sense when you live communally, and to be respectful and have honour. So whenever from now on you say oral markets, you think oral markets, may you have good. And the response is, Unyahi white bitch, may good be upon you, may you have good. Because we are good people. And we don't want to fight. They made us fight.
Údar Bríd Ní Chíanáin.
I'd just like to thank everyone for having me, and thank you, Jay, for getting me here. It's great always to be in Belfast, and I would really love whoever read the book to send me your feedback on it, your thoughts. There's an email address in the introduction of the book. I'd really love to tell me more of how can I enrich the work. Because a lot of people would say, oh, great work, and so, no, tell me how can I improve, please.
Yeah, you want to come in?
Yeah.
So see.
Hello everyone. I have questions. My name is Talha AlAli. From Palestine, from Gaza, and I lost my father. I lost my brother last August, and I went to my therapy, and I told her I lost my father, I lost my brother, and she told me, Mustafa, you must to accept the truth. I can't accept that. Never. I can't accept. And also I can't accept anyone told me, so sorry, you lost Mustafa. I can't accept that. Never. My question is, why they killed my father. My father was a doctor. Why they killed my brother? My brother was accountant. And they are normal people. Why they killed them? I need answer. Can human rights answer me? Can anyone answer me? Thank you. The answers.
Well, I think we actually know the answer. They're Palestinians. That's the answer.
Unfortunately.
Unfortunately, that is the answer.
Yeah.
They're Palestinians. Yeah. And often hear when people say, oh, why did somebody go to jail? We say, because they were Republicans. Because they were Republicans. That's the nature of what we've been talking about here today. My heart goes out to you. And your father and your brother were not lost, they were murdered.
Sure.
And anybody that says that you lost them, you didn't leave them in the supermarket on the way home and forget to pick them up.
Sure.
They were murdered. And there's no acceptance in that.
I want to say, we are not victims.
No, of course not.
We are not just numbers.
You are not victims, no.
We are Palestinians.
Yes.
We are landowners.
Yes. That's right. That's right. Bruno.
Cardia, gur míle maigah as a bheith mar chud den fé seo. It's been an honour to have Bríd Ní Chíanáin and Mustafa up here sharing their experience with us. Gur míle maigah, and if you would like to take another a leaflet just to see what else is happening during the festival, because as we've just spoke about, it's together that we make our community strong.
Thank you.